So, moving on from our plenary session this morning, I think those conversations have left us in a great place now to start this next section, which is specifically about the national policies and the implementation of those around biodiversity. And it seems to me that it's the implementation that's kind of been emerging as an issue. So I'm delighted to have our two speakers, Andy Bleasdale and Shirley Clerkin, here to tell us more about it. Andy Bleasdale is Principal Officer with the National Parks and Wildlife Service, which we've heard so much about. And so, as our first presenter for today, please give Andy a warm welcome.
That's your forward button. Perfect. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Delighted to be here. An absolute privilege to be in your company and to hear the very engaged conversation so far this morning. So hopefully I won't add to your deliberations in terms of complications that I'm about to present to you. I'm a civil servant working for the National Parks and Wildlife Service in the Department of Housing, Heritage and Local Government. And I guess our job is to advise on the policy frame against which governmental decisions are taken in the context of biodiversity. So before I get stuck into the detail of my presentation, I'd like to just explain who I am. So just so you know that I'm a person, not just a machine, not just a civil servant. I'm like one of you, a member of this state, committed to this state and obviously biodiversity within it. So I'm a Clareman. I live in Connemara. I work in the National Parks and Wildlife Service. I'm a botanist by training. I've been working in the National Parks and Wildlife Service since 2000, officially on the books, but before that on contract to them. I'm now one of the 5 directors of the National Parks and Wildlife Service, and I'm part of the NPWS Management Board. That's a vast and onerous responsibility that I take quite seriously. And I guess trying to capture the views of what you're discussing here today in the frame of a national conversation within NPWS, but also then across government. And then behind that, I lead the scientific team within the National Parks and Wildlife Service. Just by way of context, because I know the National Parks and Wildlife Service has been mentioned this morning and obviously over previous discussions that you've had as well, we're in a process of transformation that is both daunting but also exciting. We've prepared a new strategic action plan for the transformation of the service, which will invest more money, more resources, more integration across how we do our business within the frame of the state. So I hope that in the years ahead, while this journey is challenging, we'll also become better fit to enable the state to engage more proactively on biodiversity policy and delivery of protection for biodiversity within the state. So as I've mentioned, I'm one of the directors of the National Parks and Wildlife Service. There are 6 directorates, and I'm just very briefly going to show them to you here. I sit in the top left-hand box there, scientific advice and research, but there's a whole suite of other functions that the service provides in terms of enforcement, nature protection, conservation of nature within sites, delivery of conservation measures, engagement, the corporate support spine behind us, legislation and licensing. Many of those issues you've already touched on in your dialogue this morning. So that's the broad narrative of how we work within the government department I'm in, but also the work that we're doing to transform how we can better do our work in future. I've been asked to talk to you about nature designations in Ireland. So this is a serious and legally underpinned topic, but also gives us the tools, we hope, to actually ensure the protection of both habitats and species within a suite of sites in the state. So under the Habitats Directive, this is, Micheál O'Brien already mentioned that directive this morning. It's a really important directive that preordains the requirement across each of the member states, including Ireland, to select the best sites for protection of a suite of listed habitats and species that are important at European level. In Ireland, we have 59 habitats to protect within our Natura 2000 network within the SACs, the Special Areas of Conservation, and a range of Annex II species on that directive as well. Our job is effectively to ensure, through the designation of those sites, the protection of those habitats and species. So that's grand in theory, but how do we actually do that? And I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. And we're expected to monitor the condition of those habitats and species at national level and report on that condition to the European Commission. We have a similar obligation under the Birds Directive. So you may have heard of the special protection areas that are selected for birds. Our job is even a bit more onerous within the Birds Directive in that all birds require protection. So not just within the SPAs that are selected for them. But basically we're expected to manage and protect and control birds, their eggs and their habitats through the designation of sites, but also through wider protections in the wider countryside. So that is, again, quite a big task. So we have two big directives to deliver, which we've transposed through national law into SACs and SPAs for protection nationally. And these are meant to be our jewels in the crown of things to be protected at national level. What does this look like then in the context of Ireland? If we put a map of Ireland up there, you can see, not very clearly possibly, but you can see colours on the map of both our SACs, of which there are 439, and our SPAs. Vast areas of the landscape of Ireland is protected under the SAC and SPA network. 13.56 or something of that order is designated as either SAC or SPA on land, and also protection at sea as well. More of which to come in due course through further marine protection and designation in the years ahead of both SACs and SPAs. Again, all fine and dandy in theory, but what does that mean for the people who own, use, and derive income from those lands? It's important to know that in Ireland, we're somewhat different to many other member states in that much of our land in Ireland is privately owned. It's not state-owned land necessarily. Much of our land in Ireland is farmed. I think the statistic of 70% being farmed was mentioned earlier this morning. Of our designated land, 59% of that is farmed. So what we need to do is we need to proactively engage with the users and the owners and the farmers of those lands. Otherwise, designation becomes a paper exercise. We're protecting on paper this land, but unless we engage proactively through partnerships, through incentives, through enforcement with the people who own and use those lands, we're really at nothing. So just some slides of some of the things we're trying to protect: our marine habitats and species, our bogs and peatlands and the species that use them, our coastal sites, our farm sites, again, depending on farmers' engagement with farmers, providing supports and incentives to farmers to manage those lands better. And then our freshwater pearl mussel habitats in wetlands and in rivers, and our woodlands. These are all the things we're trying to protect through the formal legal designation of sites. So what do? We identify our SSCs and our SPAs. We report to the Commission on the condition of those habitats and species at national level in 6-year cycles. We set conservation objectives and targets for the management of those sites, which are important tools in appropriate assessment and ensuring that activities that are taking place on and within or out with but affecting those sites are considered in the context of objectives we have set. Then we engage with other departments and agencies and bodies to provide incentives to support farmers and landowners to manage those sites. And then we try and proactively engage with the EU, but more broadly with stakeholders at national level to impress upon them the importance of this management. We do surveys. I don't think I'll go into much more detail than saying this is a major part of the work that I do within my unit. We are providing the scientific imperative and underpinning to assess the condition of those habitats or the requirements for better management of them in future by dint of the pressures and threats that are ongoing within them. And we provide a whole range of reports up on our website, Irish Wildlife Manuals, describing the conditions, the features, the threats and pressures to those habitats and species within individual sites for that feature across the network, and that's all published on our website. And then we report to the European Commission, as I've mentioned, in 6-year cycles under Article 17 of the Habitats Directive and Article 12 of the Birds Directive. That is a legal obligation that we must do that in those cycles. And again, within that reporting, we're highlighting some pressures and threats to those sites, and that should then prompt an action by the state. And maybe that's the missing link. We, in the scientific side, can continue to monitor and report condition, but if ultimately that condition is going downward over time, which we're finding that it is, what is the state's response? What is the European response to that problem? And I guess that's what you're here to discuss. So we need the data to inform that decision-making process, that understanding, but that should then prompt an action, and maybe that's sometimes the missing link. Again, we publish our information to the Commission on our website for a range of habitats and species under those directives. Okay, what is the news then? If green is good and red is bad, you can see a lot of red on some of those slides. If you look at the pie chart on the top left where we have status for the Habitats Directive habitats, you can see that only 15% in our most recent report to the European Commission in 2019 are in good status. So that's not good. The species, which is in the bottom left-hand corner of that slide, that pie chart, has 57% of our species listed under Annex 2 of the Habitats Directive are in good condition. So the situation is better for species than it is for habitats. So 85% of our habitats are not in good condition. And then what do we do about that? The trends, you can see them there on that slide as well, but I won't go into detail on that in the interest of time. The situation is a bit more complicated for bird species in that you've equal amounts of green and red in terms of population trends for the 209 species we report on over time, both in short term and long term. But that sometimes masks the trends that are happening, say, for farmland birds, for breeding waders, for curlew, which you may have heard of, that are taking nosedives in terms of their population success within Ireland. Not just within Ireland, but across other member states as well. So what do we do for breeding waders? What do we do for farmland birds? What do we do for curlew? How do we provide incentives for improved management of the habitat that those species depend on? That is the challenge. What's driving this? Where are we coming from? Where do we need to go to? These are pressures and threats, but of themselves, agriculture isn't a good or a bad thing. It's just a thing. If it's appropriately directed to support biodiversity, then it's a really good thing. If it's damaging biodiversity, it's a really bad thing. How do we get the porridge right between intensification and land abandonment across a landscape of a network of sites? Really, really challenging. And that brings us back to the partnership and engagement and outreach discussions with the farming organisations, with the Department of Agriculture and with the farmers to provide incentives and sanctions if they don't choose to take up those incentives to protect our sites. Other threats and pressures to our Natura network: development, water pollution, forestry. Again, neither good or bad, but the wrong tree in the wrong place can be damaging to biodiversity. Extraction of resources. Again, neither good or bad, but if it's damaging a Natura 2000 site, our species or habitats, then it is bad. And then the threat of invasive alien species coming at us. So we've set our conservation objectives to inform the management of the features that we select within our Natura 2000 network. These are setting the gold standard for those habitats and species. What is that telling us, though, in terms of the protection of those? It's more an exercise in identification of the things to be considered, but it doesn't provide the means by which we actually protect. And maybe that, again, is the missing link. How do we deliver conservation measures, an appropriate response to threats and pressures across our network? And not just within our network, but in wider biodiversity out with the network as well, in the wider countryside. Challenging. But we've been trying to describe our effort collectively, not just within the National Parks and Wildlife Service, but across government in our National Biodiversity Action Plans. These are really, really important documents that set a cross-governmental ambition for working in partnership for a suite of actions that are identified over phases of those plans. We have had 3 plans to date, all of which have now expired, and we're, as has been mentioned earlier by Art and others, we're in the process of engaging now on our 4th National Biodiversity Action Plan, which is open for public consultation, and that consultation will close at the end of, in early November. We've actually delayed process on the plan, to answer the question that was posed earlier, to ensure that your deliberations are captured and reflected in the final version of the plan that goes out. So we've kind of stalled progress on it to allow you to catch up with us, or for us to align, basically, so that these 2 documents become coherent when they're eventually communicated. What is the vision of this plan? It's broad. It's to value biodiversity, to conserve biodiversity, to restore biodiversity, to sustainably use nature, to maintain the ecosystem services that we all depend upon, and to create a sustainable planet derived from the Ireland's contribution to that. That is challenging, obviously, but there's a whole suite of objectives that are more granular and give us the means to achieve that broad ambition. How do we adopt a whole of government, whole of society approach to biodiversity? Discuss. How do we meet the urgent conservation and restoration needs? Discuss. How do we secure nature's contribution to people? Again, how do we make the link between what nature is and what people need of nature, but also depend upon from nature? How do we link biodiversity protection and conservation with the ambition that is already in situ for climate action? They're 2 sides of the same coin. We need to integrate them and to see that these are dual benefits if we work together and collectively. How do we improve the evidence base to manage and track biodiversity change and loss and improvement? And how do we strengthen Ireland's contribution to the European and international biodiversity conversation? In the draft plan that's out for public consultation, we have 162 actions in the plan. And we would very much encourage you, I know you're already busy and committed to doing what you're doing, but for your voices to be captured in telling us what we haven't captured in the plan and to add to that before we actually finally publish. Challenges then. Finally, I'm coming to an end, you'll be glad to hear. There are many challenges. You've already touched on most of them this morning, but there are more besides. How do we have the resources and the capacity within NPWS, within government, across wider society to embrace this challenge going ahead? How do we get coherence and integrate sectoral approaches across government to ensure that we're aligned for biodiversity? A big question. You know, we do with what we do. I, in my department, do what I do. The Department of Agriculture does what it does. But we need to integrate and ensure alignment of policy direction for biodiversity, for climate change, for water management, etc. How do we provide incentives? You've discussed that this morning. And how do we strengthen enforcement through legislation, but also through delivery of the application of that enforcement on the ground? How are we seen to be visible to stop a polluter or a damager, but also providing an incentive for someone who might be considering intensifying, but is provided money or an incentive through a scheme to actually diversify and extensify to support nature and biodiversity. And in doing that, we need to develop partnerships. It cannot depend on the state, unfortunately, or on the government within the state. It certainly cannot only depend on National Parks and Wildlife Service. We're only part of a much bigger solution. But if the solution depends on us, I'm afraid we may have a problem. And then to provide policy and guidance to ensure that all understand what is required in the years ahead. And then future policies coming at us as well. Micheál O'Brien mentioned the EU biodiversity policy, our strategy to 2030, and the nature restoration law. So notwithstanding what we have to do now, things are coming at us that we will have to do better in the future in terms of further protection and restoration ambition across the state. The state needs to be set up to deliver on that ambition and to work collectively together through funding, through guidance, and through integration of policy direction in the years ahead. Challenging times, but I hope the flavour of the complicated world in which I live is being shared with you today, and I'd be delighted to hear your feedback later on. Thank you very much.